Oh, it's a beautiful day. It's not too cold, but it's time to get back on the road again.
It's March 18th, and the first day for a while where the roads are dry. The sun is shining and the temperature's just above freezing. I can't think of a better way to spend a couple of hours than rolling along on my Moto Guzzi Nuovo Falcone. I've ridden this road dozens of times on many different bikes, but the Nuovo Falcone never fails to put a smile on my face. It's not fast, and sometimes the gears aren't always there when you want them, but it's like an old dog, always ready to go, but only at the speeds it can manage. The Opinicon Road cuts diagonally across country, from the Perth Road to Highway 15, crossing the Rideau Canal at Chaffey's Lock, one of the many lock stations between Ottawa and Kingston. It's a road I like. There are plenty of twists and turns and a few spots where I like to stop and look out across the water, or at this time of year, the ice. It traverses typical Canadian shield terrain of low rocky hills, lakes, ponds and bogs. The biggest hazards are not other vehicles, which as you'll see are fairly rare, but the deer and wild turkeys, which often linger on the road, then scatter erratically. There are a few houses scattered along the route, but for the most part it passes through forest and old pasture. I still really haven't figured out why a slow, old-fashioned bike which can only struggle up to a maximum of 70 miles an hour, as long as the road is flat and there's no headwind, and is really happier below 60 should be such a delight to ride, but the simple truth is, it is. Of the 5 bikes in my garage, the Nuovo Falcone is the slowest by a very wide margin, yet next to my beloved Eldorado, it sees the most road. One spring morning a few years back, I was riding my Eldorado home from breakfast when the rear tire blew just about here. I didn't have a patch kit, spare or tools, and there was no cell phone service or traffic. So with the bike idling in gear, I walked it for a couple of miles, hoping to reach the farm we just passed. By the time I got here, I decided to take a rest, hoping that someone would be along to help. After about 20 minutes, the first vehicle along was a Harley. The rider stopped, and I rode pillion until I could get a cell phone signal a dozen miles down the road. Sons with pickup trucks are mighty handy. The original white pine-dominated forest was cleared from this land more than 150 years ago, as settlers moved into the area to try and scrape a living from the land. The forest that grew to replace it consists mainly of maple, oak and ash, but here and there are a few white and red pines are beginning to appear. Most of the old farmsteads are long gone, but here and there a few of the old farms have struggled into the 21st century. But their days of sustaining their occupants with the products of the field are long gone. At this time of year I like to stop whenever the road runs close to the lakeshore to see how the ice is faring. No matter what the air temperature, once the sun starts to rise in the sky, the water starts to flow and the ice begins to melt. It starts with the creeks and streams where running water beneath the ice gradually breaks through. The open water slowly expands while the ice turns grey and punky. This is one of my regular stop spots on Telephone Bay near the western end of Opinicon Lake. Only a tiny part of Opinicon Lake is visible from this area. Like many of the lakes along the Rideau Canal, the level was changed when a control structure was built at the next constriction downstream at Davis Lock. Most of these low forested hills are composed of bedrock and talus with very little soil. Only the bottomlands have any soil to speak of, and many of these were bogs before ditches and exhausting manual labor converted them to marginal farmland. It's hard to imagine now, but in the mid-19th century, every little scrap of land which could be farmed was farmed. It must have been a hard scrabble life. The small cemetery at the side of the road contains the remains of generations of people who extracted a living from this unyielding land. Whenever we talk about canals, it usually brings to mind a human-dug trough, such as those in Britain. The Rideau Canal is nothing like that. Instead, it's a string of natural lakes and rivers, which were strung together as a navigable waterway by cunningly adapting an ancient First Nations canoe travel route, and by adding a lock here, a control dam there. By raising this lake and digging out that rapids, boats could travel the whole distance from Kingston to Ottawa, relatively unimpeded. The canal was built following the War of 1812 to provide a safe way to connect the British military establishment at Kingston on the eastern end of Lake Ontario with Montreal. The British military decided that it needed a route free from the possibility of blockade or interference from the Americans along the St. Lawrence River, the only other viable route. Most of the 125-mile-long canal route used the existing rivers and lakes, so that although water levels in some areas were changed quite dramatically, most of the route required very little engineering. These days there's only recreational traffic along the canal. The lakes attract fishermen and boaters, while cottages line many of the lake shores. Before the construction of the Rideau Canal, Indian Lake was connected to Opinicon Lake by 1,500 yards of rapids. Samuel Chaffey, who settled here in about 1820, built a grist and carding mill on one bank of the river and a sawmill and distillery on the other. He placed a mill dam upstream of his mills, which regulated the level of Indian, Clear, and Mud lakes. Both the rapids and Chaffey's mills presented the canal builders with some problems, but in the end a large lock was built using the main channel, and a defensible lockmaster's house was constructed immediately adjacent to the lock. Chaffey's Lock can be a busy little place in the summer, although there's still not much to it. The hamlet is dominated by the Opinicon, a sprawling tourist lodge which was originally built to serve the needs of American tourists. There's a few houses, and then the local store has some basic supplies. By this point I was starting to get a little chilled, and snow was in the forecast for later that afternoon. With temperatures hovering only marginally above freezing, even when the sun is out it doesn't take too long before the cold starts seeping into fingers and toes. I was ready to head for home. Usually I make a circuit, but this time I simply retrace my steps, dodging traffic jams and congestion all the way home.